There are places people aren't supposed to go. We all knew it, even before the trail began to narrow, before the snow came harder, faster, and the shadows of the trees seemed to lean closer. White Ridge Pass, Bryce had said a week earlier, grinning as he tapped the faded map spread out on my kitchen table. It's remote, untouched. Nobody goes there anymore. We should have asked why. It wasn't the kind of hike you did for fun. It was the kind you did to prove something. Snow-covered trails, sub-zero temperatures, no cell service, it wasn't a vacation. But Bryce had a way of making reckless sound exciting. "You're not scared, are you?" he teased, looking around the group. Trey rolled his eyes. "Please. It's just snow and trees." Lena, always the bold one, smirked. "I'm in. Let's see if you can actually keep up, Bryce." And that left me. I wasn't scared exactly, but something about White Ridge Pass felt wrong. I couldn't explain it, so I just nodded and went along with it. The morning we set out, the trailhead was deserted, a blanket of fresh snow muffling every sound. Bryce led the way, his enthusiasm cutting through the biting cold. Trey and Lena followed close behind, their voices occasionally breaking the stillness. I trailed in the back, the weight of my pack digging into my shoulders. It wasn't long before the usual sounds of the forest faded. No rustling animals, no chirping birds, just the crunch of our boots on the snow. "It's too quiet," Lena said, looking over her shoulder. Bryce waved her off. "It's winter. Animals hide. Nothing to worry about." But she wasn't wrong. The quiet felt oppressive, like the forest was holding its breath. By midday, the sky had darkened, gray clouds rolling in as the temperature dropped. The trail grew steeper, winding through dense pines that seemed to swallow the light. "You guys see that?" Trey asked, stopping suddenly. "See what?" Bryce asked, turning. Trey pointed to a cluster of trees up ahead. "Thought I saw someone. Probably a deer," Bryce said, starting forward again. But Trey didn't move. "That wasn't a deer," he muttered. We didn't see anything else as we climbed, but the feeling stayed with me, that gnawing sense of being watched. We stopped in a small clearing just as the first flakes of snow began to fall. "This'll do," Bryce said, setting down his pack. "We'll camp here." None of us argued. The fire Bryce built crackled weakly in the cold, casting flickering shadows across the clearing. We huddled close, eating in silence. "Anyone else feel weird about this place?" Lena asked, her voice low. "It's the middle of nowhere," Bryce said. "That's the whole point." But even he didn't sound convinced. That night, the wind howled through the trees, rattling the tents. I lay awake, staring at the sagging ceiling of my tent, unable to shake the unease that had been building all day. It wasn't just the quiet or the cold. It was the feeling that we weren't alone. Around midnight I heard it, a faint sound, carried on the wind. At first I thought it was just the trees creaking, but then it came again. A child's cry. It was soft, high-pitched, and trembled with desperation. "Bryce," I whispered, unzipping the tent. He stuck his head out of his own tent, his face pale. "You heard it too? What's going on?" Lena asked, crawling out of her tent. Trey joined us, his flashlight shaking in his hand. "It's a kid," he said, his voice trembling. "That doesn't make sense," Bryce said, standing. "There's no one out here." "Then what the hell is that?" Lena snapped, pointing toward the trees. The crying grew louder, more frantic, like the child knew we were near. "We have to check it out," Bryce said, grabbing his flashlight. "No, we don't," Trey said quickly. "It's not our problem." But Bryce was already moving toward the sound, his flashlight cutting through the trees. "Wait," Lena called, but he didn't stop. Trey and I exchanged a look before grabbing our gear and following. The forest was darker than it should have been, the snow reflecting faint traces of light that seemed to play tricks on my eyes. The crying led us deeper, winding through the trees, growing louder and more desperate with every step. We came to a small clearing where the snow was untouched, except for a single set of footprints. Small footprints. "Where are they?" Bryce asked, his voice tight. The crying stopped. We froze, listening, but there was nothing. No wind, no animals, just silence. Something's not right, I said, turning back toward the trail. But before we could move, a new sound broke the quiet. Footsteps. They were deliberate, crunching softly in the snow, circling the clearing. "Hello," Bryce called, his voice shaking. The footsteps stopped. Then, from somewhere just beyond the tree line, came a soft laugh. The kind of laugh that makes your blood run cold. Bryce raised his flashlight, sweeping the beam across the trees. That's when we saw it. The figure. It stood just beyond the light, its outline sharp and still. "Who's there?" Bryce shouted, taking a step forward. The figure didn't respond. Tilted its head slightly, like it was listening. And then it turned and disappeared into the trees. None of us moved. "What was that?" Lena whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know," Bryce said, his confidence gone. But I could see it in his face. He was scared too. As we stood there, frozen in place, the crying started again. Only this time it wasn't coming from the forest. It was coming from the clearing, right where we were standing. The crying wasn't faint this time. It was loud, piercing. It surrounded us, like it was coming from the very air we were breathing. "What the hell is going on?" Lena shouted, spinning around, her flashlight beam jittering wildly across the snow. "It's close," Bryce said, his voice trembling. Too close. He wasn't wrong. The sound wasn't coming from the trees anymore. It was here, in the clearing with us. Trey bolted first, sprinting toward the direction of the camp. "Don't run," Bryce yelled, but it was too late. "Go," Lena hissed, grabbing my arm. I didn't argue. We ran, our footsteps pounding through the snow, the cold air burning in my lungs. We burst into the camp, the weak glow of the fire doing little to ease the terror clawing at my chest. Trey stood near the fire, bent over with his hands on his knees, gasping for air. "You left us," Bryce shouted, shoving Trey's shoulder. "Something's out there," Trey shot back, his voice cracking. What the hell was I supposed to do? The crying stopped again. The silence was suffocating, pressing down on us like the weight of the snow on the trees. "Okay," Bryce said, his voice tight. "We're packing up. We're leaving right now." "And going where?" Lena asked, her breath still visible in the freezing air. "We can't see the trail in the dark, and you know it." Bryce hesitated, glancing toward the edge of the camp. "Then we wait until morning," he said finally. I didn't like it. None of us did. But he was right. We sat close to the fire, its weak flames barely pushing back the dark. No one spoke. The forest seemed alive now, every creak of the trees and whisper of the wind setting my nerves on edge. And then Lena said, "What's that?" We all turned toward the sound. A soft scraping, coming from just beyond the firelight. It wasn't the wind. It was deliberate. I grabbed the nearest flashlight and shone it into the trees. At first, I didn't see anything. Then the beam caught something, movement low to the ground. "What is that?" Lena whispered, stepping closer to me. It was small, just a shadow at first, but then it stepped into the light. A child. She couldn't have been more than 6 years old. Her frame thin and trembling, her clothes ragged and torn. Her face was pale, her lips blue, her dark eyes wide with fear. "Oh my God," Lena whispered. "Are you okay?" Bryce asked, stepping toward her. The girl didn't respond. "Where are your parents?" Lena asked, her voice soft. The girl raised a hand and pointed to the trees. And then, very slowly, she smiled. It wasn't the kind of smile a child should have. It was too wide, her teeth small and sharp, her lips curling in a way that made my stomach turn. "What the hell?" Trey started. But before he could finish, the girl turned and darted back into the woods. Bryce lunged forward. "Wait! Stop!" I shouted, grabbing his arm. "Did you see that?" Trey said, his voice shaking. "She was smiling," Lena whispered, her face pale. "She was smiling like she wanted us to follow." No one moved. The fire cracked faintly, but the forest was silent again, as if it was waiting for us to decide. Then we heard it. A low, guttural laugh, deep and raspy, coming from the trees. It wasn't the girl. Couldn't have been. We're leaving, Bryce said, his voice firm. We'll find the trail. We'll make it work. We can't, Lena shouted. If we leave now, we'll get lost. We stay, we're sitting ducks. Trey snapped. The laugh came again, louder this time. It wasn't alone. It was joined by another, and then another. Laughter, coming from every direction, surrounding the camp like a circle tightening around us. I grabbed the hatchet from my pack, my hand shaking as I held it close. The fire dimmed suddenly, the flames sputtering as the wind picked up. And then, from the trees they came. Figures. Dozens of them, stepping into the faint light of the fire. Their faces were pale and hollow, their eyes dark and unblinking. Each one of them was smiling. "Oh my God!" Lena whispered, backing toward the fire. Bryce grabbed a branch from the flames, holding it like a torch. "Stay back!" he shouted, waving it toward the figures. They didn't flinch. The figures stepped closer, their smiles widening. One of them, a man with jagged teeth and sunken cheeks, reached out a hand pointing at Bryce. "You shouldn't have come," he rasped. The words were low and hollow, like they'd been pulled from the bottom of a well. None of us moved. And then, as suddenly as they appeared, the figures stopped. One by one, they turned and disappeared into the trees, leaving us alone with the dying fire. What just happened?" Trey asked, his voice trembling. No one answered. As the fire flickered out, I noticed something carved into the snow where the figures had stood. A spiral surrounded by jagged lines. It hadn't been there before. And when I looked closer, I realized the snow beneath it wasn't white. It was red. The red snow glistened in the faint light of the fire, the spiral carved deep into its surface. "What is that?" Lena whispered, her voice trembling. Bryce knelt beside it, his flashlight casting long shadows across the clearing. "It's blood," he said, his voice low. Trey took a step back, his face pale. "You're joking." Bryce didn't respond. He didn't have to. I crouched next to Bryce, my heart pounding. The spiral wasn't random. It was deliberate, every curve and line perfectly measured. "This wasn't here before?" I said, my breath visible in the freezing air. "No kidding," Trey muttered, his voice sharp with panic. Lena stood frozen near the fire, her flashlight shaking in her hand. "They did this," she said, her voice barely audible. "Those people. They left it." "Why?" Trey snapped. "What does it mean?" Bryce stood, his jaw tight. "It's a warning." The words hung in the air like a weight. A warning. To leave? To stay? We didn't know. "We need to get out of here," Trey said, grabbing his pack. "And go where?" Lena asked, her voice rising. "We don't even know where the trail is anymore." "Anywhere but here," Trey snapped. Bryce hesitated, his eyes darting toward the dark woods. "The trail leads west. If we head that way, we'll hit it eventually." Lena shook her head. "In this storm? We'll freeze before we find anything." "We can't stay here," I said, stepping between them. "You saw what they did. You think they're just going to leave us alone?" No one argued after that. We packed up quickly, the fire sputtering out as the storm picked up. The woods around us seemed alive now, the shadows moving with every gust of wind. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. We headed west, Bryce leading the way, his flashlight cutting through the snow. Trey stuck close to me, his head on a swivel as he scanned the trees. "Do you think they're following us?" he whispered. "I don't think they ever stopped," I said. The storm grew worse as we walked, the wind driving snow into our faces and obscuring the trail. The cold seeped into my bones, my fingers numb even through my gloves. "Bryce!" Lena shouted, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Are you sure this is the right way?" "Yes," he called back, though he didn't sound convinced. We pushed on, the silence between us broken only by the crunch of snow underfoot. And then we saw it. The cabin appeared suddenly, its dark silhouette barely visible through the storm. It was small and weathered, its roof sagging under the weight of the snow. "This wasn't on the map," Bryce said, frowning. Who cares? Trey said. It's shelter. The door creaked as Bryce pushed it open, the sound sharp against the howling wind. We stepped inside cautiously, our flashlights sweeping the room. It was empty, the air stale and cold. The walls were covered in marks, lines, symbols, and crude drawings scratched into the wood. Great, Lena muttered, setting her pack down. It's like a creepy art gallery. Let's just warm up and figure out our next move, Bryce said, kneeling by the stone fireplace. I walked to the nearest wall, my flashlight illuminating the carvings. One symbol stood out, a spiral surrounded by jagged lines. The same one we'd seen in the snow. They've been here, I said, my voice trembling. Who? Trey asked, his face pale. The people in the woods, I said, turning to face him. This was their place. Bryce managed to light a fire, the weak flames casting flickering shadows across the room. We sat close, the warmth doing little to ease the chill in my chest. I don't think they want us here, Lena said, staring at the spiral on the wall. You think? Trey snapped. They left us a blood drawing, Lena. They're not exactly welcoming us with cookies. The wind howled outside, rattling the shutters. The fire crackled softly, but it didn't feel safe. Felt like we were being watched. Then came the sound. A soft, rhythmic tapping, coming from above us. What the hell is that? Lena whispered, clutching my arm. Bryce stood, his flashlight aimed at the ceiling. It's the wind, he said, though his voice wavered. That's not the wind, Trey muttered, backing toward the fire. The tapping grew louder, more deliberate, like footsteps pacing across the roof. And then it stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. Maybe we should check it out, Bryce said. No way, I said quickly. We stay together. Lena nodded. Whatever's out there, it's better to stay in here. But Bryce was already moving toward the door. Bryce, wait, Lena shouted, but he didn't stop. He opened the door, stepping out into the storm. Bryce, I called, grabbing my flashlight and running after him. The wind was fierce, the snow blinding as I stepped outside. Bryce, I shouted again, my voice barely carrying over the storm. I saw his flashlight beam flickering near the corner of the cabin. He was staring at something. When I reached him, my stomach dropped. Carved into the snow in front of the cabin was another spiral, fresh and perfect, the lines sharp against the white. And standing just beyond it was a figure, tall, thin, and smiling. Bryce's flashlight flickered, and in the brief darkness, the figure moved. When the light came back, it was closer, much closer. The figure's smile didn't fade. It stayed frozen, stretched too wide, as if their face had been carved into that expression. Bryce, get back inside, I whispered, my voice trembling. But Bryce didn't move. Neither did the figure. Bryce, I said again, louder this time, grabbing his arm. Finally, he turned to me, his face pale. It's watching us. No kidding, I snapped. Let's go. Now. The figure tilted its head slightly, like it had heard me, and then it raised a hand, pointing directly at Bryce. The smile widened. I yanked Bryce's arm, dragging him toward the cabin. The door slammed shut behind us, the weak glow of the fire flickering in the draft. What happened? Lena demanded, rushing toward us. There's someone out there, I said, my voice shaking. Bryce didn't say anything. Trey peered out the window, his breath fogging the glass. Is it gone? He asked. I don't know, I said, trying to catch my breath. Gone. Bryce finally said, his voice hollow. It doesn't need to go anywhere. It knows where we are. The tapping came again. Louder this time, more deliberate. It wasn't on the roof anymore. It was on the walls. Is it circling us? Lena whispered, her eyes darting to the shadows cast by the fire. The sound moved, rhythmic and slow, scraping against the wood like nails on a chalkboard. Maybe it's the wind, Trey muttered, but his voice wavered. You know it's not, Bryce snapped. I shone my flashlight toward the window, the beam cutting through the dark. First, I saw nothing. But then, just for a second, I caught a glimpse of it. a face pressed against the glass, pale and grinning, before vanishing into the shadows. "They're playing with us?" I said, my throat dry. "Why?" Lena asked, her voice trembling. "What do they want?" No one had an answer. The fire flickered lower, the cabin growing colder as the storm raged outside. Trey sat near the door, the hatchet in his lap, his eyes fixed on the floor. "We can't stay here," he said finally. "And go where?" Lena asked. "They'll follow us." "At least we'd be moving," Trey said. "I can't just sit here and wait for them to." He stopped suddenly, his eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" It wasn't the tapping this time. It was a voice, faint and distorted, carried on the wind like a broken whisper. "Come outside." The words made my skin crawl. "No," Lena said firmly, backing toward the fireplace. "We're not doing this. We're not going out there." But the whisper came again, louder this time. "Come outside. We're waiting." "They're trying to split us up," Bryce said, his jaw tight. "It's a game to them." "Well, I'm not playing," Trey snapped. But then we heard the cry. The child's cry, sharp and piercing, like a scream ripping through the storm. Lena covered her ears, shaking her head. "No, no, no, no. We're not doing this again." "It's not real," Bryce said, his voice steady. "It's a trick, just like before." The cry came again, more desperate this time. I stood, my flashlight shaking in my hand. "We can't just ignore it," I said, my stomach twisting. "You want to go out there?" Lena asked, her voice rising. "You saw what's out there." "We don't know what's out there," I said. "And that's worse." Bryce grabbed his pack and opened the door. "Bryce!" Lena shouted. "We can't stay here," he said, stepping outside. "If they want us, they'll take us. Cabin or no cabin." Trey followed reluctantly, muttering under his breath. I hesitated, glancing back at Lena. "You don't have to come," I said. Her jaw tightened, and she grabbed her flashlight. "Like hell I'm staying here alone." We left the cabin behind, the storm swallowing the weak glow of the fire. The snow was deep, the wind biting at my face as we trudged toward the sound of the cry. The footprints appeared suddenly, small and deliberate, leading into the trees. The crying stopped again, replaced by the faint rustle of movement. "What's that?" Trey whispered, pointing ahead. A faint light flickered through the trees, glowing dimly in the storm. "Another cabin?" Bryce asked, his voice tight. "Maybe," I said, though I didn't believe it. We followed the light cautiously, every step heavier than the last. The snow seemed to pull at my boots, like it didn't want me to move. When we reached the source of the light, my stomach dropped. It wasn't a cabin. It was a circle of torches, the flames guttering in the wind. In the center of the circle was another spiral, this one carved into the frozen ground. And standing at the edge of the circle were the figures. Dozens of them, their faces pale and empty, their eyes fixed on us. "Don't move," Bryce whispered. But they were already moving. The figures stepped into the circle, their feet crunching on the frozen ground as they turned to face us. One of them raised a hand, pointing at me, and then they smiled. The figures moved slowly toward us, their steps crunching the snow around the spiral etched into the ground. They weren't ghosts. They weren't supernatural beings. Their faces stayed hidden in the shadows, but their forms, they were human. Humans who shouldn't have been there. "What do they want from us?" Lena whispered, her voice shaking. No one answered. Bryce gripped his flashlight tightly, as if it were some kind of weapon. "Let's get back to the trail," he said quietly, his tone leaving no room for debate. "We can't," Trey said. "They've surrounded us." And they had. The figures positioned themselves deliberately, circling us. They didn't get closer, but they didn't move away either. "They're watching us," I murmured. "Why don't they say anything?" Lena asked, tears welling in her eyes. "Maybe they don't need to," Bryce replied, taking a deep breath. "Listen to me. We're gonna back away slowly. Keep eye contact with each other, and don't turn your back." We began to move. Every step felt heavier, like the snow wasn't just resisting us, but as if the entire place itself was working against us. The figures didn't move, but I could feel their eyes following us with every step. When we finally got out of the circle, Bryce gave a single, quiet command, "Run," and we ran. My legs felt like lead, the snow dragging at my boots with every step. I could hear Lena's panicked breathing, Trey's endless muttering, and Bryce yelling for us to stay together. But the worst part was the footsteps, not ours. The sounds behind us grew louder. Footsteps, faster and more aggressive than ours, gaining on us. "Run faster," Bryce shouted. "They're chasing us," Lena screamed, her voice cracking. Eventually, we saw it. A faint light through the dense trees, a tall lamppost near the edge of the trail. It was the first sign that we were close to civilization. "There!" Trey shouted, pointing ahead. Summoning every ounce of strength, we sprinted toward the light. As we broke through the tree line, the figures stopped. They stayed in the shadows, just beyond the clearing, their forms motionless as they watched us gasp for air under the lampost's glow. Bryce was the first to speak. They were people. "We know," Trey muttered, not looking at any of us. "What were they doing out there? What did they want?" Lena asked, her voice breaking. None of us had answers. When we made it back to town, we went straight to the local sheriff's office. The deputies listened to our story, though their expressions made it clear they didn't believe us. "There aren't any settlements near White Ridge," one of the deputies said. "If someone's out there, they've been avoiding people for years. Could be reclusive types living off the grid. But their faces betrayed their discomfort. They said they'd investigate. But when we called a few days later, there was nothing to report. We didn't find anything," they said. "Just your tracks in the snow." Trey never spoke about it again. Neither did Lena. But Bryce and I sometimes reflect on that night. The way the figures stood there watching and eventually disappeared. Sometimes the scariest thing isn't what you see. It's what you can't explain.